Welcome back. As promised, I am back again with my second video in this series that I'm going to be doing every month for at least the whole year. My 5 favorite comics of each month. I learned a few things last month, so hopefully this time will be a little smoother. Last time, I spent a little too long with my honorable mention pick. This month, I liked a lot of comics. As I go through every month, I read 20 to 30 new comics every single week. If I really like one of these comics, I write it down. Last month, I just so happened to have 6 comics written down. This month, there were 10. So I have 5 honorable mentions and 5 that I'm going to go through in more detail. That being said, consider this your official spoiler warning. When I get into the actual video, the 5 comics that I thought were my favorite comics of the month, there will be spoilers throughout all of there. So keep that in mind. If that's a deal breaker for you, I'll see you later. But if not, then I look forward to discussing these with you. But with that being said, I'm going to just get my 5 honorable mentions out of the way real quick. I'm not going to get into them at all. Consider these my 10 through 6 favorite comics of the month. I'm just going to go rapid fire, one by one. These are in no particular order either. I Am Batman, number 6. Animal Castle, number 3. Ghost Rider, number 1. Catwoman, number 40. And then Maniac of New York, The Bronx is Burning, number 3. Those were my honorable mentions. Okay, so we are at number 5 on my top 5 February comics. These first 3 choices that I have are all final issues of miniseries that wrapped up this month. I chose them mostly because the final issue was just really that good, but also because I love the overall individual series so much, and this is really my last chance to really put them in one of these videos. There's not going to be any more issues of these books, so I wanted to specifically point them out, especially if they made my short list for my favorite comics of the month anyway. So that being said, my number 5 pick of the month, I'm going with Primordial, issue number 6. This is the Brian Michael Bendis variant. It's a strange cover, but I love Bendis, so I had to rep my boy. This is an interesting comic about the shortest possible explanation is it's about animals in space, but that does not do it nearly enough justice. It takes place during the Cold War in the space race when the United States and Russia were both trying to figure out how to put a man into space. And before we put humans into space, we sent some animals up there. This book is about those animals and their journey, but also their owners, I guess, on Earth trying to get them back, trying to make sure that they come back to Earth safely. We have 2 monkeys in this book. Their names are Abel and Miss Baker, and then there's also a dog in here named Leica. It's really hard to explain specifically why this book resonates. If you have a dog, you will be impacted by this book because it is written and drawn in such a way that it feels very real. The art is by Andrea Sorrentino, and it is written by Jeff Lemire, also with colors by Dave Stewart. I should point all that information out. If you have any heart at all, if you are in any way an animal lover, Primordial will be a very tense, emotional book because over the course of these 6 issues, you really grow to care for all 3 of these animals and their people down below on planet Earth, trying to reconnect with their loved ones, with their animals. So it's a very special book. I'm glad it was 6 issues. It wouldn't have made as much of an impact if it was a longer series. It reads really quickly, so I think when this comes out in hardcover here pretty soon, it'll be a good binge read because most of the action here is told from the perspective of animals, so not that much dialogue. You get a lot of like thought bubbles from animals when they have like single word thoughts like danger or help, that kind of stuff. So it reads really quickly, but you don't want to go too fast because the art in here by Andrea Sorrentino is next level. There's so many abstract geometric shapes going on here. There's a lot of cubes, a lot of like micro images within these cubes all throughout the page. It's a very unique looking book. It's almost nice that Jeff Lemire didn't put too many dialogue word bubbles in the way of all this beautiful art. So yeah, that's Primordial. That's my number 5 pick for the month. Number 4 on my list is another book that just ended. This is a mini series that actually made my top 10 books of 2021. Let's see if I can do this right. My top 10 books of 2021 up here somewhere. um, this book came in at number 6 on that list. At the time, I had said I really like this series so far. It only had 6 issues out at the time, but I knew that this was going to be a favorite of mine regardless of how it actually wrapped up. And I was waiting for the final 2 issues to come in to give my total and complete thoughts on this series. The series in question, of course, is Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow. This is issue number 8 of 8. It's a very simple story, really, when it comes to the plot. You have Supergirl, and you have this other girl, Ruthie, whose father was murdered by a bandit. And she asks Supergirl for help to track this guy down across the galaxy and get revenge for the murder of her father. It is the plot of the Western movie True Grit, but in space with Supergirl. It's a very cool idea. It's written by Tom King with art by Bilquis Evely, and the colors in here, especially by I think it's Mateus Lopez. In this issue, issue 8 in particular, I don't think it's anything different, but something about the colors in this issue really grabbed hold of me. I think the art in here is super intricate and detailed, kinetic, action packed. This is just a deceptively simple story, revenge story. If anything, I think that is my biggest complaint about this book. By the time you reach issue 8 and you wrap up the story, it ends in the only possible way it could have ended. So I guess that's a complaint. I don't really think it is. I don't think every story needs to have like a surprise twist. Sometimes it's just about the journey that you go on while you enjoy the story. There's a lot of dialogue here. This is told from the perspective of Ruthie, the girl who is on this revenge quest, and she is very verbose, very intelligent. She uses a lot of words, a lot of big words. She likes to talk. Almost every panel of this book has a very, very thick narration section. So each issue of Supergirl just takes a little bit longer to read than your normal comic. These issues are packed with words. There's no other way to put it. Especially if you're like me and you've never read anything with Supergirl in it before, I really think you should give this series a try. Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow, 8-issue miniseries by Tom King. It's perfect. Even if you are somebody who is not the biggest fan of Tom King, he writes a lot of other maxi series that are kind of depressing to be totally honest. They're really good, but they are kind of a downer in a way. But this book, Supergirl, has a sort of a sense of adventure that those other series are lacking. So I think if you are particularly not the biggest fan of Tom King and things he's done in the past, Supergirl is a refreshing change of pace and even more evidence that he is a solid writer. Okay, so now we are at number 3, and for this one, this is the last of the picks that I have so far that were the final issues of older series from last year. I'm going to be honest and say that I just sat down and reread this book to formulate my thoughts and what I was going to say, and by the time I got to the end, I was struck with the exact same hard emotional response that made me put it on my list in the first place. That being said, the book in question, let's do that better. The book in question is Fantastic Four Life Story, issue number 6. This book got me, man. If you're unfamiliar with the Life Story line of comics, it started with Spider-Man Life Story, and now we have Fantastic Four Life Story, where the premise is it takes the origin story of the Fantastic Four, where they get their superpowers on a ill-fated space adventure back in the 1960s. That's all in issue 1, and then it ages the characters in real time. So issue 2 takes place during the 70s, issue 3 during the 80s, and so on until we get to issue 6 up in the 2010s. And since they age in real time, they get old. They get old over the course of the story. You get to see a side of these characters that you don't ever get to see in the mainstream Marvel continuity. For example, Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic, and Sue Storm, the Invisible Woman, they are married, they have a son named Franklin, and in the main Marvel comics, Franklin is like permanently 10 years old. But in this story, Franklin is allowed to age up, and by the end of this comic in the 2010s, he is an adult in and of himself. He has his own children, and Reed and Sue are both old people. But I'm not really explaining anything that happens in the story. When they go out into space in issue 1 and they get their powers, Reed Richards sees Galactus, sees like a vision of Galactus, and when he gets back to Earth, he tries to warn everybody that Galactus is coming and our planet is doomed, and nobody really believes him. And so he spends the bulk of this series trying to formulate defenses for the planet so they will be saved. And so he spends the bulk of this story locked away in his lab, working and ignoring his life, which is really sad because by the time you get to the end, the whole conflict with Galactus is resolved in issue 5. And then in this final issue, it's mostly an examination of the family. And since they're all so old and their lives are short at this stage, they are examining their failures and things that went wrong. And this issue has a lot of really heartfelt messages about love and family and regret. It's just it really hurts in a good way. It's a very strong emotional punch, this comic. It's written by Mark Russell, who is on my radar, as he should be on all of your radars as well. He is the writer of this book, Not All Robots, which made my top 10 2021 comics last year. I believe it was number 2. It almost doesn't feel like this book was written by Mark Russell, the Fantastic Four life story, because it is not that funny. He's mainly known for comedy slash social commentary. That's how I've always described his writing style. But this is an emotional comic that really affected me on a way that not a lot of other comics have. This is just it's a beautiful book all around, and I think especially if you are somebody who is not a Fantastic Four fan, I think this is a pretty safe way to get that whole story, but condensed in a 6-issue miniseries that is a lot easier to digest than attempting to read 60 issues worth of Fantastic Four comics going back to the Silver Age. One's a lot easier than the other. So we're down to the top 2 books of February 2022 for me, and these 2 books are both ongoing. The other 3 are all done. They are the last chapters of their respective series, and I wanted to make sure and mention them while I still had a chance. I also objectively thought they were 3 of my 5 favorite books of the month. That being said, my number 2 pick is unique. I don't know a lot of other people that are reading this series, but it has been one of my favorites since it started. This is The Rush. Issue number 4. The Rush it's a silly acronym that I don't particularly care for. It stands for This Hungry Earth Reddens Under Snow-Clad Hills. I don't care for that. I like The Rush. Written by Si Spurrier with art by Nathan Gooden. This book takes place during the gold rush, when everybody was rushing out west to try and dig up gold. And the main character of this book is a mother named Nettie Bridger, whose son left home to go search for gold, and he stopped writing letters. He basically stopped communicating with her entirely. So she decided to go search for him in this town called Brokehoof, which is a really creepy town where everybody is fascinated with the idea of striking it rich and uncovering gold from under the ground. That is a very real thing that happened back in those days. And that's one of my favorite things about this book is the sense of historical realism. So much so that the dialogue in here is what I assume is historically accurate. I don't know enough about the time period to say exactly, but it definitely reads different, old-timey kind of dialogue in here, which I really appreciate. It lends this book even more of a historical vibe to it. It reminds me a lot of the show Deadwood on HBO, which actually takes place in the same time period and deals with another kind of mining town. Both Deadwood and the Rush comic, they both have a historically accurate period sense of dialogue. Deadwood, maybe not so much with the cursing. There's a lot of cursing in there. I'm not sure how accurate that element is, but they definitely don't sound like the way we talk today. So I appreciate that element of the Rush comic. But also, since we're only 4 issues in, we're still peeling back some of the deeper mysteries of this book, but there are some horror and supernatural elements here that are really scary. The first 3 issues of this story, those elements have kind of been on the periphery, the edges of the story. As Nettie searches for her son, there are glimpses in the woods of this giant spider monster, what looks to be like a man riding a spider. It's scarier than I'm making it sound, trust me. In this issue, issue number 4, things come in from the periphery into in full focus in the center of this story. We actually get dialogue from this spider guy, and he's very scary. He appears to be kind of corralling these people and keeping them in this town. This is a comic from Vault Comics, who's a pretty indie publisher, and they seem to focus on a lot of horror stuff. They are definitely on my radar. I'm getting another book of theirs called The Last Book You'll Ever Read, but other than that, I don't really have a lot of exposure to Vault Comics, and I want to keep my eye out for more in the future. I'm always keeping my eye out for more horror comics in general, but Vault, I think, is a really good publisher of horror, and this book, The Rush, is my favorite example. All right, we made it. We're at number 1. Thank you again for getting all the way to the end of this video. It means a lot knowing that my opinion is at least interesting. Whether or not it matters to you is a different story, but you care enough to make it almost to the end of this video. At least there's still one comic left on my top 5 list. I'm going to give that one to Crossover, number 11. This book is a very interesting story. So the first 6 issues of Crossover, I guess I should be fair and say the first 5 issues of Crossover were not really my favorite. It wasn't my least favorite by any stretch. If I had to guess, I'd say if I ranked every comic on my pull list in some sort of informal ranking, Crossover in the early stages would have been just above the middle. So like a high 6 or maybe a 7 out of 10. Really good, but not my favorite. It wasn't until the end of the first arc and then this second story arc that is now over halfway done. It wasn't until that point that this book really evolved in such a way that it has me looking at the whole story in a completely different way, and now it's my favorite book of February. The first chunk of Crossover, the whole premise in general deals with characters from comic books crossing over into the real world. So literally every character in every comic book in existence is now in our world, but through some sort of magical shenanigans, they are all trapped inside of a dome in Denver, Colorado. The first story arc of Crossover deals with a little girl who manages to get out of that dome. She is found by the main characters of this book who work at a comic shop, and they take it upon themselves to bring her back to the dome to reunite with her family. I don't want to sound like I'm hating on it too much, but that first story arc, it didn't grab me. The premise was cool. They interacted with certain characters that I recognized, especially in issue 6. I think that's when the scale and the potential of this book started to really make itself known, because you got to see some of the characters that Donny Cates, the writer of this book, was playing with. Also, the book is illustrated by Jeff Shaw. And in issue 6, they start to bring in other characters from the wider Image Comics universe. You get to see people like Hit Girl, like the Walking Dead zombies are all over issue number 6. Even like Battle Pope and the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Savage Dragon. Witchblade was in there. It's just a lot. There's a lot happening, and it really gives you a sense of like the crazy potential of this comic. But it wasn't until the second story arc where things got really meta, and it really became like no other story I have ever experienced. Crossover is my favorite book of the month because reading this comic for the last few months, it really is like no other comic. The second story arc is dealing with the deaths of various comic creators. After this crossover event, comic characters crossing over into our world, certain creators are being mysteriously killed. That plot element has been teased throughout the series, kind of in the background, but it is now the front and center mystery of this second story arc. The magic of this book really hit me in the head around issue 9 and 10, when the characters from Powers started to come into this comic. If you don't know, Powers is a classic comic written by Brian Michael Bendis with art by Michael Avon Oeming that deals with police detectives in a world with superpowers, but they are normal detectives trying to solve crimes that take place in this superpowered world. those two detectives are in charge of this case in this crossover story arc. Once that started to unfold, then this comic really grabbed and pulled me in, especially when these two characters brought in Brian Michael Bendis. This is hard to explain. They brought in the comic book version, the real life version of Brian Michael Bendis into the comic, into the police station to interrogate. Basically, they were interrogating their own creator. Not only that, but Donny Cates brought on Brian Michael Bendis and Michael Avon Oeming, the team who created Powers. They came in to actually write and draw that sequence. So it was deliciously meta in all of the best ways. And it didn't stop there. I don't want to give away all the secrets and all that's what makes this book fun is you literally you open an issue of crossover, you have no idea what comic characters are going to show up, what comic creators are going to show up. There's nothing else like it, and I will only caution people, you have the more you know about Image Comics specifically, the better time you will have reading this book. I think part of the reason this series didn't land for me until now is a lot of the characters they mentioned early on in this run I didn't have any familiarity with. Madman, for example, is featured really early in this book, and if you have read that comic, I have not. If you have read Madman, you probably will enjoy the earlier issues more than I did, for example. So if you are coming into crossover completely cold without reading stuff like The Walking Dead or Powers or Madman, then you might not appreciate it as fully. That's my only caution, I guess, is make sure you are at least a little bit familiar with a bunch of the classic Image comics before you try crossover. That's it. That's my number one pick for the month. Crossover number 11. We did it. We made it. We made it through my 5 favorite books of February. That's apparently the take I'm gonna go with for this outro. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of this. My fingers are crossed that this will end up being a shorter video than last month's top 5 of January. I had a lot to say. I have a lot to say this month too. I'm just trying to say it faster. Stay tuned for my favorite comics of March. I'm just gonna keep this idea rolling. I'm having fun picking my 5 favorite books every month. It's making me read and evaluate my thoughts more critically, which is important. I like doing that, and I hope you guys enjoy this content. Like and subscribe, turn the bell on, do the YouTube stuff. I'm gonna go. I'm gonna get out of here. I will see you guys next month.